Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Wayne,
I'm Anadea Judith.
and this is Voices for the Future, another episode. Today, we have a program called Rewriting the Constitution, and our special guest, is Beau Breslin. He's a constitutional scholar, and he's the Joseph C. Palamountain Professor of Government at Skidmore College. He's the author, most recently, of A Constitution for the Living, imagining how 5 generations of Americans would rewrite the nation's fundamental law, published by Stanford University Press. And prior books are From Words to Worlds, Examining Constitutional Functionality, and The Communitarian Constitution. And I'll just, before we get into, start with questions, Beau, I'll just say a little bit about the book. The book, your book, Constitution for the Living, takes the famous debate between Jefferson and Madison about the merits of generational constitutions. And obviously James Madison won that debate, but the book imagines what America would be like if Jefferson had prevailed in that debate. Instead of an enduring constitution, Jefferson argued that each generation ought to write its own fundamental law. For the sage of Monticello, enduring constitutions, like America's, represent just another form of tyranny. Indeed, he said, one generation should not be beholden to another. The earth, he wrote, belongs in usufruct to the living. And in the book, after the original first chapter, which goes into a history of constitutional thought, the book then imagines a Jeffersonian world in which America witnessed constitutional conventions in 1787, which was the Constitutional Convention, the last Constitutional Convention, then 1825, 1863, 1903, 1953, and to bring it to present time or future time, 2022. So welcome, Beau. Thank you very much for joining us. This is going to be a very fascinating conversation.
I can't be more pleased to be here. Thank you both for having me.
Yeah. I asked you about when we were chatting before we started about the concept of originalism, which runs counter to this idea of a living constitution or Jefferson's ideas of the Constitution being rewritten. So I just wanted, if you could set the stage, what exactly is originalism? Because we heard a lot about it, and it's almost as if that's like the Constitution is a sacred document and cannot be touched. But I'll let you say more.
Yeah, so originalism really, Michael, is an interpretive theory, right? It's a way in which some judges see their job, and ultimately it is a belief that the proper way to interpret the Constitution is to think of the original meaning of the text. The words mean something, and interpret current law, often whatever it is, through the prism of the original understanding of the constitutional document and its words. And Scalia, Clarence Thomas are the two most recent, not the only originalists, but the two most famous originalists. And it's that particular theory of interpretation is juxtaposed against theory that a constitution kind of evolves over time, and that the living Constitution has to kind of keep up with the times, and the framers did not intend or did not couldn't have anticipated some of the problems that we deal with, and so judges have to interpret the Constitution in much more of an evolving way. And this debate between originalists and the living Constitution has been the major debate over the last couple of generations about the proper interpretation of the text.
Uh-huh. So you said Scalia, Antonin Scalia, the late Supreme Court justice, was one of the most famous originalists, but who were some of the others going back?
Well, I mean, Scalia brought it to a new, he wrote a book about it. And so he brought it to, he kind of is the sage of originalism. And it's more the people who have come after him, right? So Clarence Thomas is, Amy Coney Barrett is to a certain extent. She's not quite as much as Scalia is. And prior to that, there weren't as many originalists as we currently have, but roughly 1/3 of the court, or at least it was when Nino Scalia was, Nino was his nickname. That's a decent amount of originalists on the court.
Yeah.
It's a kind of fundamentalism that it's all similar to what you see in the Bible, that this was the original word of God. And, even though we're 2,000 years later, it's in the Bible that, it still holds, and the world has changed so terribly much, especially in the last few generations.
Correct. And if I'm Scalia, and I disagreed with almost everything Scalia said, right? I always found him entertaining because he was super smart and he always had kind of a sense of humor on the court, but I disagreed with his thinking on everything. That said, he would tell us that originalism is the only way to interpret the Constitution, because if you are sort of embracing the idea of constitutional interpretation from a living perspective or evolving perspective, you're just putting your own passions and interests and proclivities into the text, and then the words are not meaningful, right? There is a reason we have a written constitution, Scalia would say, and it is that the words are meaningful. But if you can put your own passions into the document, those words become less meaningful. My response to him is there any number of responses, right? Who are you going to call out as the original framers, right? It can't just be the 55 people in Philadelphia in 1787 or the 39 that ultimately signed the document. What are you going to do about anti-federalists, those who had a stake in it, right? We have a Bill of Rights because anti-federalists said we need a Bill of Rights. Are they part of the original understanding of the Constitution? Is it just those who drafted it? And what about over time, the evolution of ideas? Like framers could never have anticipated wiretapping. Is that part of the original thinking on unreasonable searches and seizures? That's the kind of I think illogic of the originalism idea.
Yeah, and it seems like it really has to, you're stretching logical thought to meet the hypothesis.
Yeah.
And who's to say that the founders didn't have their passions when they wrote the Constitution?
Oh, of course. Well, I mean, to be fair, we can chuckle about it. The reality is, as you know so well, the framers were elite white men who wrote a constitution in order to protect their property. There's no question about it. So then you bring in Jefferson's argument. He was roundly criticized by his, and I'm not a Jeffersonian, I'm a Madisonian. I think enduring constitutions mean something. I'll say that right off the bat.
You might want to say for our listeners a little bit about the whole Madisonian Jefferson.
Sure. So, and then I'll get to the question. But so, as Michael mentioned, there's this fascinating debate in American history between Madison and Jefferson. So Madison is in Philadelphia. He writes the Constitution. He's one of the 39 who drafted it, but he's the major player, right? At the end of the day, we call him the father of the Constitution. He's the major guy. He is a mentee of Jefferson. Jefferson's a mentor to Madison. So Madison's done with the work in Philadelphia, and he ships off the Constitution to Jefferson, who's in Paris. And Madison, in this letter, in this series of letters, is asking Jefferson what he thinks of the Constitution. He cares deeply. Madison cares deeply what Jefferson thinks. So Jefferson, they get into this correspondence where they're writing back and forth about parts of the Constitution between 1787 and 1789. And there's this very famous moment that Michael mentioned where Jefferson says, oh, I like certain things about the Constitution. I like this, I like that. But what I really don't like is that there's no sunset clause for the Constitution. There's no mechanism for each generation to write its own Constitution. And for him, that was a completely and utterly meaningful concept. Because imagine Jefferson in the moment thinking, okay, we have this bunch of my generation writing the Constitution, but future generations, why should they be beholden to what amounts to 55 white men? That's a form of tyranny, just like tyranny of the majority is a form of tyranny, or colonization is a form of tyranny. Being beholden to a past generation is just another form of tyranny. So Jefferson writes to Madison and says, look, we need each generation to write its own Constitution, and I've done the numbers, right? He was a very mathematical guy. Said every 19 years we ought to write a new Constitution because that constitutes a new generation. And for him, that meant that roughly half the population dies every 19 years. So he had done all the calculations, and for him, every 19 years. Madison writes back and says, no, Tommy, no, that's not the way we do it, right? We want an enduring Constitution so that it builds up the credibility and stability of a government. And so your generational idea of constitutional conventions doesn't make sense. So we know, as Michael said, we know that Madison won the debate. Our Constitution, 234 years. That amounts to, in terms of every 19 years, roughly 22 generations removed. So, or I should say 11 generations removed, right? All my book is, as Michael points out, is imagining if we lived in a Jeffersonian world, right?
Yeah.
And so in that context, Jefferson he would have put to bed the idea of originalism, because we would have had a Constitution that was written 19 years ago, and we'd be ready for the next one in 2022, which is a fascinating idea to think about.
Yeah. And do you think if Jefferson would have been in the room in 1787, not being the minister to France, he may have had a little more sway? Maybe,
but I mean, Jefferson was a fairly quiet guy at the time, right? He's not so quiet in 1800 when he berates John Adams, but he's a fairly quiet guy at the time. So I'm not sure he would have pushed this so much based on his personality. The other interesting thing about this footnote to all this is that there was another huge American figure who happens to be British, who also believed in generational constitutions, and that's the great Thomas Paine.
Oh, sure.
So Jefferson and Thomas Paine, if they had gotten enough of the people to agree that we need generational constitutions, then we might have seen a lot more. And the last footnote I'll put, lots of states, guys, have this mechanism in place where it's either every 20 years we're going to rewrite the Constitution, or at least every 20 years we're going to have a ballot initiative, a referendum that says, should we rewrite the Constitution? So Jefferson won at the state level. He didn't win at the national level.
And you point out, Beau, in your book that since the ratification of the Constitution, since 1789, there's been 2,200 constitutions written worldwide, which is an average of 15 constitutions written per nation. And yet the United States has had two, the original Articles of Confederation, which lasted 11 years, and the current Constitution, which is 234 years in running.
Correct.
And a critic might say, well, you can always amend the Constitution. That's open all the time, but that does not happen. The last time was what, 1992? 1992? And that was about congressional pay?
That was about congressional pay. And as Michael knows all too well, the great irony in this is, and especially if we have this kind of cool conversation juxtaposed against the Equal Rights Amendment, the great irony is that 1992 amendment was originally proposed by Madison in his original Bill of Rights, right? The original Bill of Rights, Madison proposed 17 amendments, 12 make it through Congress, and 10 are ratified by the states. That's why our Bill of Rights is only 10. But one of those original 5 that dropped away in the congressional in that 1789 was this pay one that we now have in 1992. That's the great irony here.
Yeah. That's
so if you were to, rewrite a new constitution every 19 years, which seems pretty often, I mean, how would you even go about doing that? That's a massive undertaking.
It is, and Anadea, so one of the things that I think would have happened, like if we can imagine a Jeffersonian world, right? Sure, 19 years was roughly a generation back in the late 18th century and early 19th century, but of course it's not a generation now. The people living a lot longer. What I did in the book was I took the spirit of Jefferson's idea about generational constitutions, and I understood, I basically calculated the life expectancy of the average person at the time. So the life expectancy of the average person in 1787, when our original Constitution was 38 years. That's why my next one is 1825. But by the time you get to the 20th century, let's imagine we're having our Constitutional Convention in 1953, which is one of my chapters. The average life expectancy in 1953 is 69. So that puts us at 2022.
I see.
What's interesting is our current average life expectancy, although it dropped a little bit, is close to 80. So the next Constitutional Convention, if you go by life expectancy from 2022, would be in the 22nd century. And I'm not sure we have this is the interesting thing, I'm not sure we have a country to constitute with global warming and so on in the 22nd century. So in the Jeffersonian world, it may be that this is the end of the road. But Anadea, that's you can't do it every 19 years. It would be too much of an undertaking. But yeah, every 50 years, sure, it would take about 5 years of Congress getting ready, figuring out who's going to be there, figuring out what interests are around the table, and then ultimately getting people to go to Philadelphia.
Now, if you did that, what would be to prevent like a dominant, we have one party that is dominant in power at different times and it switches back and forth. So the party, if the Republicans are in charge or the Democrats, from dominating the whole constitutional process?
Yeah, so fantastic question. The answer is none of it would be easy, right? Because of our polarized and some would argue tribal society, political society here, where we're farther apart than we've been in a long time. That said, most people who talk about returning to Philadelphia for a new constitutional convention would prefer regular citizens like the three of us to be writing the Constitution, not political actors, right? Sure. In 1787, a lot of them were political figures. They were prominent figures. No, that's not the way you do it now. And if you do it you can do it any number of ways. You can populate a constitutional convention based on random selection. Lots of people argue that, right? You don't want it to be too big. The problem is you can't make it 1,000 people. You'll never get anything done. Exactly. So what's the right number? And then how do you populate it? The last thing I'll say about this, Anadea, is some people argue that, okay, let's have roughly 300 people at a constitutional convention. That's a roughly manageable, thinking about Congress works at 435 and then 100 senators. But let's say we have 300. 200 are randomly selected citizens. 100 are picked 2 per state that can provide some expertise, right? You can have that combination, and I think it would be a good group, but nobody's a politician. That would be the rule, and I think you'd be in better shape than we currently are.
Yeah, for the chapter on the 2022 Constitutional Convention, it was I don't fully remember, but was that the makeup of the delegates? They were randomly selected, also with elected or formally selected by their states.
Yes, so I did it that way. Most people, Michael, would tell you don't do the experts, just do randomly selected citizens, like the 3 of us. The other thing that would make a difference, I think, guys, is what I call in the 2022 convention, kind of this crowdsourcing effort to, you need to make it so that the delegates are not the only ones who are influencing the outcome. No, it can't be, it can't be Wikipedia or a Google Doc where everybody's going in and changing it. But you have to have a lot of different mechanisms where the public can contribute and influence the outcome of what that writing is going to be like.
Now, if you pick people at random, they would have to be educated in the Constitution, right?
So the answer is yes and no, right? Yeah, you run into problems when you say, because the key thing is to get the right people around the table, or get interests around the table. South Africa did a phenomenal job of constructing a constitutional convention ended up being a 1997 constitution. So it's certainly in at least one generation removed. They did a phenomenal job of figuring out how to get the right people around, but it was filled with politics and so on. And today, I think you can't say things like, "Oh, it's only going to be college educated or above." Then you're eliminating a good chunk of people. I think you have to have some faith that with time, and this process will take more than the 4 months in Philadelphia, with time, people can construct a constitution, regardless of the level of education they have. You're going to have people who are experts, or who at least know enough that can guide some of this stuff, but you need all the voices around the table. That's the most important thing.
Sort of jury selection.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the way the around the world where citizen assemblies have happened and have changed laws in countries. That's what they've done. They've randomly selected people. They've done it from various backgrounds, demographics, to try and get a broad cross section of people. And in that chapter on 2022, you begin by talking about Iceland and the financial crisis and their need to create a new constitution as their country fell apart, and they jailed all the bankers. So you talk about crowdsourcing, and it didn't go all the way, but it did help to some degree, I believe, to make some changes. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so again, politics infuses, Michael, as you know, so much of what goes on around the world in these political regimes. But Iceland tried the experiment, right? Iceland is the only country to genuinely try an experiment of crafting a constitution through traditional crowdsourcing mechanisms, right? And so they had all these different influences, but ultimately the system worked in the way we're describing it, where regular everyday citizens they did 2 things. One was they did this long survey, and this very intricate survey where they were asking Icelanders, probably in part because it's a small country, but asking Icelanders, what are their greatest values? What are the values that should be embedded in a constitution? And interestingly enough, like, economic stability was not one of them. It was like individualism, freedom, and the things that we take seriously here in the US. But they asked Icelanders what their greatest values are. And then this group of citizens, based on that, crafted a constitution that was a draft, went to their parliament. Their parliament eventually, at the end of this long process, decides it's not going to adopt the Constitution. So they did like 90% of the work, had a draft Constitution, and the Parliament, for political reasons, decides not to adopt it. I think if you eliminate that last part, the parliamentary part, Congress doesn't need to approve our Constitution. It should be ratified by the people. You might get the situation might work in the U.S. better than it did in Iceland.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Madison was always concerned. You mentioned the tyranny of the majority, but really, we're much more a tyranny of minority, whether the way the Senate runs or the filibuster, and in just so many ways, the corporatocracy. So,
Right.
so yeah, people ratifying a constitution, not the Congress. So
Yeah, and you can. I mean, if you want to avoid the we don't want to. We can spend all night talking about these intricacies. But if you don't want, okay, so let's say for the moment you don't want a simple majority for a constitutional ratification by the 330 million people in the United States, right? Because that's just too, you want a little bit more of a mandate. Make it 55%, but don't make it 75% so that 25%, these, the corporate leaders can basically veto what 75% want. Make it 55% or 57%, something like that. So you at least have a decent majority, but not tyranny of the minority.
Yeah. So talking about our country now, what role do you think the Constitution plays in shaping a more peaceful and less polarized future for America?
My cynical side says not a whole lot, unfortunately, for the reason that we were talking about beforehand, and that one of our guests said, people don't read it. So people don't really know what the Constitution says, right? And one of the things that I find fascinating is that a decent number of Americans believe that, some of the all men are created equal, some of the great illuminating phrases of the Declaration of Independence are in the Constitution. No, the Declaration of Independence is different than the Constitution. So do I think the Constitution, as it's currently understood in the United States, can lead us to a better future path? Yeah, I mean, I have to believe that, but I think it's going to require a little bit more attention to some of the stuff that's in the text, right? So, for example, the reality is that the Senate doesn't work, period, end of story, right? It is the most undemocratic institution created by, I'm being a little hyperbolic, but it's one of the most undemocratic institutions created by the human hand, right? Because there is no reason why the 40 million citizens in California ought to get the same number of senators as the 500,000 citizens in Wyoming, right? So you got to figure out, one of the things we have to do if we're going to sit down and redraft a constitution is figure out what you do with the Senate, right? Are we Nebraska and we're going to make it a unicameral legislature? Probably not. But one of the things I propose is lower the impact of the Senate. Michael, at the end of the day, I think one of the things that, to get back to your original question, I think one of the things that we have lost sight of is the aspirational nature of the preamble, right? Why don't we spend any time thinking about how we can make a more perfect union, right? The reality is there are some things in there that could help us, but ultimately people don't spend any time really thinking about how the Constitution can be meaningful.
Yeah,
they use it more as a weapon than they do as a healer.
Yeah, that's well put. Used as a weapon, and of course the Senate wasn't even senators weren't even directly elected till what, 1913, 1917?
Right.
Yeah, by constitutional amendment. Yeah.
We're a very land-based country at the time. There were 13 colonies, and people rode on horseback, and it was such a different world.
It was.
You're right that they couldn't possibly have predicted this hyper-connected, jet-streamed, world that we have today. They couldn't possibly have predicted that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the framers, I mean, they did the best they could, but it's still late 18th century. I mean, it's a very different world in the late 18th century.
And they were also looking to please the Southerners. So like the 3/5 compromise. So they didn't want to upset the apple cart.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, there's a lot of problems. So in your chapter on 2022, since you brought up the Senate, and I don't think it was hyperbolic at all to say most undemocratic institution. I mean, maybe it can compete with some others, but the
Right,
Senate
around the world for sure.
but the Senate is so compromised now that for a corporation or for an oligarch, you get great return on investment. You don't have to buy off anyone anymore. You just, you just have two senators, maybe even one, Joe Manchin, or two, and you can get what you want.
Right.
But so you propose, or you mentioned Sanford Levinson, the constitutional scholar Sanford Levinson suggested it to you. But so you, in the book, I think he's the one that makes that proposal in 2022 Constitutional Convention. But I'm wondering if I'll let you say what was the proposal in terms of redoing Congress, because I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, so I mean, there are flaws. It all begins with what Congress is supposed to do, right? So Congress is our most representative institution. It's not. These are directly elected, especially the House of Representatives, directly elected by, as much as we might think the president is all as directly elected. No, it's still through the Electoral College. It's a totally different ballgame. Anyway, so Congress is supposed to be our most democratic institution. And the House of Representatives in particular is supposed to be our most democratic institution. Now, if we care deeply about democracy in the way in which I think we all care about it, what you have to do is figure out how to make it so that the House of Representatives has more authority across the board as a more democratic institution. And one way to do that, a lot of people say just eliminate the Senate. But one way that Sandy Levinson talks about it is not eliminate the Senate, but reduce the power of the Senate, to the traditional Senate, to just doing some of the duties that the current Senate does, confirming, for example, Supreme Court nominees or cabinet positions. And instead, you might create an institution, a third branch that is constituted by, it could be any number of things, but it's constituted by everyday citizens, but also experts, those who are former presidents or former Fed chairs or former Supreme Court justices, former vice presidents, who actually have some experience doing this work. And you make that a more robust institution that has kind of a national feel. So they're not tied to states. And so you have the problem of California and Wyoming. But the way in which you kind of make it so overall, Michael, is make the House of Representatives much more powerful as our institution. It is considered the lower branch, right? It is considered the less powerful of the two branches. And so you got to figure out a way to make the Senate less powerful, because it's just so anti-democratic. The other way, this super fascinating, if I can have one more minute, is, all right, let's not do it that way, because that's too radical, right? Remember, constitutional framers generally are not radical, right? They're going to all kind of gravitate to the middle. So if that's too radical to have a third branch, why don't we do this, right? Why don't we create a system where people states get additional senators depending on population? No, you don't want to make it so that the Senate is just like the House of Representatives. But let's say for every 5 million additional inhabitants or citizens of a state, you get an additional senator up to a total of 6. So California gets 6, Texas might get 5, New York might get 5, Wyoming's back to 1. So it's not an exact thing like the House of Representatives, but it actually gives a nod to more democracy. There's just lots and lots and lots of proposals out there for dealing with the Senate as the least democratic institution by the hand of man. And
well, sure. So this is perhaps would be tackled in a constitutional convention.
Sure.
I mean, spelling out ending the filibuster.
Yep.
And then going back to the House, You talk about that how James Madison had specified that the House should represent, there should be a House member for every 30,000 or 50,000.
30,000, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So the House could be like 700 or well, even more.
There's a guy, Larry Sabato, who some of your some of your listeners, or Michael, you guys will have heard of. He's a very famous and very popular political scientist at the University of Virginia. He thinks the House of Representatives ought to be 1,000 people, 1,000 representatives, and it's still manageable, I guess, doubling the size at least plus. But then you're back to representing roughly 330,000 people, as opposed to now where each Congress member represents roughly 750,000.
Yeah. And the House is just, it's a mess too because of gerrymandering.
Right.
So I don't know if Larry Sabato recommends it or suggests it, but others do, like redoing elections for the House to have multi-member districts. So
love that idea. Yep. Multi-member district, ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
These are ways in which you can, and the other thing that I would say in terms of multi-member districts, ranked choice voting, House of Representatives, is you make the terms longer. So our 2-year terms by Congress members is a compromise at the original Constitutional Convention, right? Or Madison wanted longer terms. Some of the members of the Constitutional Convention wanted monthly terms, or at the worst, yearly terms.
Wow.
And Madison's like, no. He wanted 3 or 4 year terms. So he compromised at the 2-year term. But what happens is, and this is my biggest beef about Congress, is they all, for the most part, they all care about their own incumbency, right? They care about being reelected. And so they're constantly campaigning. And if it's only a 2-year term and the campaigns are a year long or more, you're in constant campaign mode. Public financing, term limits, longer terms for Congress members would make a huge difference in the way in which politics is conducted in this country. Public financing of campaigns, term limits, and longer terms for Congress members.
And in your book in the 2022 convention, term limits did pass?
It did, yeah.
Yeah, so
9 out of 10, 89% of Americans believe in some sort of term limits for Congress members.
Yeah.
It's like, the problem is it's Congress members that would have to pass their own term limits. It's never going to happen. Right?
Yeah, and with these flaws in the Constitution and the undemocratic nature of Congress and the Senate, the level of and it shows up, I believe it shows up in the level of anger that we're seeing in this country, where over 30% of Republicans say violence is the answer to save the country. But I think it's mischanneled frustration, and I think a fair country would a fair democratic system would help them too, even though they're riled up to not believe that.
Definitely true. Any structural change that would bring about greater sense of representation is a structural change that would both Republicans and Democrats would embrace.
So I have a hypothetical question for you.
Sure.
If the Constitution had been amended every generation, or however you want to define a generation, as people live longer, what do you think today's Constitution, I don't mean 2022, but today's Constitution would read like? What do you think it would be like if we'd had those changes incrementally along the way?
Yeah, so I think a couple things would have. That's a great question. I think a couple things that we either take for granted or that we're pissed off about would be different today, right? So first, I'll say, like, the low-hanging fruit. Everybody thinks we got to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
The Electoral College would have been eliminated or at least modified dramatically at a much earlier time, Anadea, right? So it happens to work out based on my life expectancy that my first constitutional convention is 1825. most of the folks listening in will remember that in 1824 we had this kind of disastrous presidential election where John Quincy Adams wins the election, even though Andrew Jackson gets the most votes, but Jackson didn't get a majority of electoral votes, so it gets thrown into the House of Representatives as a contingent election. And John Quincy Adams cuts a deal with one of the Henry Clay, what he calls the corrupt bargain. And John Quincy Adams says to Henry Clay, I'll make you Secretary of State if you give me your electoral votes. And Henry Clay is like, sure, done. Because Henry Clay believed that being Secretary of State was the pathway to the presidency. Jefferson was Secretary of State, Madison was Secretary of State, and so on. So, that contingent election and the corrupt bargain in 1824 would have meant in 1825 we need to do something about the Electoral College. It wasn't working, right? So we would not have today the Electoral College. At least it would not be in the same way. The other thing I'll say is early on there would have been a fundamental change in the way in which we select federal court judges. Right? Because most people were pretty upset about a lot of the federal court judge decisions, Supreme Court and lower courts in the 19th century. So they would have wanted some accountability. Most states have elections of federal court judges or probationary periods. So you would today, before 2022, have a fundamentally different selection process for federal court judges. That's just two of the things that would have happened. And we would not be dealing with at the moment.
Do you think we will get rid of the Electoral College at some point, and how do you think that'll come about, and when?
Yeah, so the answer is I don't think we'll get rid of the Electoral College in our lifetime, I'm afraid, right? So and there are just too many factors involved that make it difficult to eliminate. First of all, amendments are just difficult, right? So you have to amend the Constitution to make it so that the Electoral College goes away. Then you have small things, right? Small things like the lobbying groups for the networks and the television industry, right? How does that deal with the Electoral College? They're going to fight tooth and nail to keep the Electoral College because the revenue that they get, CNN, NBC, ABC, whatever it is, the revenue that they get when the polls close in some state and you see, Wolf Blitzer saying at 7:58, okay, the polls are closing in New York, and when we come back, we'll project a winner. That revenue of that commercial is huge dollars. And if you just had a ticker behind you with all the votes coming in, that doesn't play on TV. So there's small things that would prevent the Electoral College from going away. And then there are, of course, big structural things that prevent. I think it's more likely, Anadea, that we'll get a constitutional amendment for an 18-year federal court, Supreme Court term than it is that we'll get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah. There's no other country that in the world that has anything equivalent to the Electoral College.
No, it's unique to us. And
where did Madison and the framers come up with that idea?
It was all about, see, this is one of those things that people have lost sight of, right? And Michael, as well as anybody on this call, that the Electoral College was their buffer, right? They did not want the small property owning white male to make a determination about who was going to be president of the United States, because they had no faith that small property owner knew what he was talking about. So this is Madison and the framers, just have them select, give us the suggestion and select Electoral College voters who know who's best for the presidency, right? So it was just this. We need to maintain this kind of oligarchy, this kind of elite, propertied, wealthy, land-owning reality out there, and the Electoral College does that, right? Remember, people talk about this all the time. When we go to the voting booth every 4 years to vote for a president, we are just going to the voting booth to give a suggestion to our electoral college voter to actually elect. And yeah, the job of that electoral college voter is to follow our lead. But in the early days, they didn't expect that the electoral college voter would follow our lead because they didn't have any faith that you and I could select the right person.
Yeah. And in January 6th, it was almost
Right.
Mike Pence decided that the country had a constitution, but
exactly.
Yeah. So we have a question in the Q&A box from Marie that's a good question. So I figure we'll go with a question from the audience.
Okay.
She asked, how about also revisiting the presidency so we don't have another Trump situation, following more the Swiss model, where about 7 people are elected for several years and the role of president is rotated every year. This allows for more diversity and representation. The Swiss became Swiss because they had no use for the trappings of royalty. In the US, we want our presidents to have charisma, et cetera, and given the complexity of governing to the modern age, it would seem helpful to revisit the US presidency. Any thoughts?
Oh, yes. Fantastic question, Maria. I have lots of thoughts about that. So one of the things that has been forgotten in the annals of history is the fact that the framers, I'll start here. The framers had for a long time imagined a 3-person committee as the chief executive, right? It ends up, you have kind of this 3-person committee as a possible model for the presidency. And Hamilton wanted a lifetime presidency, which was bizarre, right? Because we had just come off a monarchy, so why a lifetime presidency? So the current president 4-year term elected is a compromise of the models that were on the table, right? But the idea of multi-person Swiss idea, they had 7, we're doing 3, is actually part of the history of the American constitutional drafting. Fast forward now to today. There is, for the most part, there's no conversation really about multi-person committee, Swiss model type thing. So I don't think that has practical any legs. But what I can tell you has significant support is the idea of a single term, longer, right? So Larry Sabato has this fascinating thing where president gets a 6-year term, but at the end of year 5, there's a referendum, vote simply up or down about whether that president ought to get an additional 2 years. So you're not campaigning against somebody else. You're basically campaigning against your first 5-year record. And so a president can last as much as 8 years, but it is a 6-year term unless they get the additional 2 years with the ballot, with the referendum in their favor. That has some, that the idea of a 6 or 8 or 9-year term for a president, 1, you don't get 2, has some advantages. One is, how early will Joe Biden, assuming Joe Biden decides to run? I don't think he will, but how early will he start campaigning? He's going to start actually campaigning quietly around the midterm, halfway through his first term in office. We want a president to be focused on the job at hand, not trying to win 4 more years. So do the 1 term, longer term, or the Sabato idea. The idea of a committee probably is not going to be practical, although I think it's super interesting. But the idea of 1 term, longer presidency is much, much more likely.
Yeah. So, Beau, if you were a delegate to a 2022 Constitutional Convention, what reforms to the Constitution would you most want to see?
Yeah, super fun. So if I'm doing that, first of all, I would do things like, and I'm going to show, unfortunately, Michael, I'm going to show my own biases here, right? So I'm interested in a couple of things, right? I tend to be interested in the things that other people are less interested in. So I'll go through this. I think we need to rewrite the preamble, right? So I write in the book this, preambles are important. They're not, you can't bring them into litigation, but preambles are important. And our preamble is beautifully written, lofty, and all that sort of stuff. But most preambles nowadays recognize some story of the past and acknowledge some of the bad parts of a country's history. So I think one of the things that I would love to see as a delegate would be a rewriting of the constitutional preamble that acknowledges our horrific past with enslaved persons and indigenous people, and the way in which we essentially abuse them is too nice of a term, right? We were horrible to enslaved persons and indigenous persons. We ought to acknowledge that in the preamble. So I would like to see that. I would like to see a lowering of the threshold for amendments. It's absurd that we have the amendments 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states have to ratify. Ridiculous. That's the reason why we have so few amendments. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see some of the rights change. I'd like to see the right of privacy be in there. I'd like to see universal basic income be part of the Bill of Rights, right? So I'd like to see healthcare be part of the Bill of Rights. These are some of the things that I'm interested in. A lot of people, when they talk about being a delegate, they talk about the structural stuff, get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of the Senate. I'm less interested in the structural stuff than I am in preambles, amendments, rights, and so on. So I'd like to see those things, and in particular, our list of rights be a lot longer.
At the very least, the language can be changed around all men are created equal.
Yeah, right, for sure.
Yeah. And in the 2022 Constitutional Convention, they did add language about the environment.
Yeah, which I think is a no-brainer. That would happen no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And I would love to see that. No-brainer doesn't mean it's we should be flippant about it. There's no question that the environment would, that protecting the environment would be one of the first additions to the Constitution.
Yeah.
Would that go in the preamble?
Maybe. Lots of preambles are a lot longer. The preambles around the world in these new constitutions are, full stories. So I would love to see, in addition to, all of these things, secure the blessings of liberty and protect the environment for generations to come, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in a constitutional convention, as imagined in a Jeffersonian world, when the delegates get together, are they taking the existing constitution and creating from scratch? Are they adding to it, or are they pulling out what they don't like and adding more? Or just
in my Jefferson, so I'll answer from Jefferson's perspective, and then I'll answer it from my perspective. But I'm also curious about the two of you, right? What you think. So in Jefferson's perspective, primarily he saw it as an opportunity to amend, right? So in some ways, my book is a little disingenuous because I assume a new convention, and he assumed conventions too, but he also assumed that you would take that constitution and you change it to reflect what's going on in this current generation. I'd like to see scrap it, start over again, pull an Articles of Confederation, Michael, where in Philadelphia in 1787 they were charged with the responsibility of just amending the articles, and Madison said, no, we need to scrap it and start over again. I think each generation ought to scrap and start over again, because quite frankly, if you're influenced by what's in front of you, you're not going to get the radical change that we need in order to be successful. But I'm curious what the two of you think, right? You guys are sophisticated, and would you scrap it and start over again? Or do you think there's enough still remaining in the Constitution to just amend?
I think it would create too much chaos to scrap it and start over again. But
Yeah.
you'd have to sort out what is long-standing here, what is still true, what is still relevant, what are the values that we still hold to, and what is outdated, and to separate the wheat from the chaff.
A
Yeah,
lot of people think your way.
yeah, that's a good point. What is outdated? I mean, it would come down to the makeup of all the delegates, because you could run up against intransigence with depending on where the delegates are coming from
Right.
and philosophy. But I personally believe there's much that is not addressed or is wrong in the Constitution or has never been revised from, as you talked about before, Beau, the mistreatment of African Americans and Native Americans in the birth of this country, and even over the course of its history, Jim Crow laws and everything. Uh,
Absolutely.
that still needs to be codified into law. I mean, it did in the 1960s with the Voting Right and Civil Rights Act, but then it gets chipped away again and again.
Right.
And now we're getting, we've given the pendulum has swung back to states thanks to the Supreme Court in 2013, giving states the right to interpret the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
So it's such and again, it gets into the tyranny of minority that the majority of this country wants to see, just is left of center, but the laws just keep regressing in a poor way to protect.
Sure.
Yeah.
I want to remind our listeners that this is a good time to ask questions. You can type them into the chat, or you can type them into, where are you getting them, Michael?
Yeah, the Q&A box has another question in it.
Yeah.
Maria again. She wrote, thank you. She wrote the question about the Swiss. We do have a cabinet, so maybe that could be the legs for the committee structure. Trump for more than 4 years would be a disaster internationally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think
so there's one of the things that I find fascinating. One idea that has been floated around is that the president, so as you all know, the qualifications for a president are pretty thin, right? You have to be a certain age, you have to be a natural born citizen of the US, and so on. Add to the qualifications that nobody can be a president who hasn't either served as a elected official in any capacity. It could be Pete Buttigieg or Nancy Pelosi, and or served in the military. And a lot of people have feel like that would be a good addition to the qualifications of the president, right? Community, public service as part of the military, and or public services as a elected politician. That would have eliminated Trump, of course. It would have eliminated some other presidents, but it would have eliminated Trump for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or if there was no electoral college, that would have eliminated Trump also.
True.
And Bush. And
and Bush, right? Absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. From 2000, 2016, and 2020, the gap in the two parties difference has just grown more and more. It was like 500,000 that Gore won by, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
3 million in 2016 for Hillary Clinton and 8 million in 2020 for Joe Biden.
No, for sure. And I think part of that is the Trump factor, right? So my great fear here, and I'll admit to being a solid Democrat, right? My great fear here is that the midterms is going to be a disaster for Democrats.
Yeah.
And that I'm not sure Trump will win in 2024, but I don't think Biden is the answer for the Democratic Party either.
no.
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious that at the moment democracy is not working very well. The
Correct.
gerrymandering and and stalemates and all that. Do you think that it has to fall and collapse in order to start over and draft a new constitution? I mean, just talking realistically.
So realistically, I think there's almost zero chance of a constitutional convention in the next 50 years. And yes, maybe, Anadea, the answer is that we need to reach rock bottom in order to make it. But I don't think we're going to reach rock bottom, right? Trump was from my perspective, not from everybody's perspective. My father thought differently, but from my perspective was quite damaging to the American democratic, ethos. Hugely, but there's a decent number of people who think that he's the white savior, right? So I think I don't think that the democracy is plummeting in anytime soon. I think it's damaged. I think it's fragile. I think it's weak. But I don't think we've reached rock bottom, and I can't imagine that we will unless something more drastic happens that looks a little like January 6th, where Mike Pence doesn't have a conscience, and all of a sudden we're in constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I've often asked myself, what if Mike Pence had behaved differently on that day?
Yeah.
What would have happened?
Right. And we forget. I mean, one of the things that we forget is that, that in some ways, we're not in this moment, right? Let's be fair. But the Civil War, of course, was the one that tested everything about our constitutional and political environment, right? And I mean, for the longest time, we were two countries, right? For a long time. And we were able to survive that, right? I'm not sure, short of a true civil war, that we would ever, that we're going to get to the point where people will write a new constitution. There's too much reverence for the Constitution itself, right? And part of that reverence is innocence. Part of that reverence is ignorance. People just don't know what the Constitution says and how it protects people. And so I don't think, Anadea, we're going to be in that situation anytime soon. But I fear for democracy in the U.S. because I don't think I'm 55. This is the least democratic moment in my adult lifetime.
Same here. Yeah. I never expected to see this.
Right.
What about the dominance of the two-party system? Do you think that you see that going away anytime in your foreseeable future?
The answer is no, because all the structures are, we have so many things that feed into the two-party system, right? Our electoral system that is first past the post, right? Unlike the parliamentary or proportional representation systems in Europe, right? That's a major hurdle. The other major hurdle that people don't spend any time on is that if you compare our two-party system to the multi-party system in Europe, one of the things that keeps us from having a multi-party system is our First Amendment, right? There's a big wall of separation between politics and religion. In Europe, you have multi-dimensional parties. You might have a liberal party that is a particular religious, and you might have a liberal party that's a different religious, has a different religious background. So you have these multi-party systems, but our First Amendment that prevents the connection between politics and religion makes our parties one-dimensional. They're just on the political spectrum. Until we eliminate things like that, or until we can maneuver around things like our electoral system and the First Amendment and so on, we're always going to have a two-party system. Yeah. And that's a shame, because I think there's some interesting ideas out there that never going to win anything.
And as you said earlier, the media, the news agencies, they thrive on that kind of football game competition. We have a question that came in from the listeners. Any ideas about the Second Amendment?
Well, I mean, I'm a good Democrat, so I'd like to eliminate the Second Amendment. And I think the Second Amendment, talk about originalism, Michael, I think the Second Amendment has been misinterpreted for centuries, right? It is it's not, as you all well know, it's very poorly written, the Second Amendment, but it's not meant to give individuals the right to bear arms. It's meant to arm a militia. So I think the idea of its expanded notion that all of us can walk around with an AK-47 is just misleading and mistaken. And I can't imagine, I have a hard time understanding why my father thinks differently, right? As a conservative Republican from Virginia, right? I don't get it. Like, what is it about the language of the Second Amendment that isn't tied to the National Guard or the militia or anything like that?
Yeah, it's gotten out of hand, out of
Out of control. Right.
Far from, a vaguely worded amendment.
They couldn't have predicted drive-by shootings and mass shootings at, rock concerts and things like that. I mean, that was not anything in the spirit of it. Lisa also asks, is there no check to protect against the dangerous, inciting speech of a megalomaniac like Steve Bannon? When is it considered to have crossed a constitutional line?
Unfortunately, our First Amendment, and this is one of the things where we should be most proud of, right? So I spent a lot. The answer is there are, of course, some limits. You can only say certain things at certain moments of the day. Steve Bannon can't be driving down Lisa's road at 3:30 in the morning with a bullhorn deciding what he wants to say. But assuming he's not doing that, he can say whatever he wants. And here's the thing, right? We want that to happen, right? We want Steve Bannon to have the power and the authority to be able to say whatever he wants, because ultimately the pendulum's going to turn to the liberal side too, right? And I always say this to my students, right? Most of the time, most of my students will never need the First Amendment because they'll never say something that's so controversial or so Steve Bannon-like. But it's very nice to have that protection in the event that you do say something that is at the extreme. So, and people inevitably ask me, like, what that is. Well, one of the most famous cases in our lifetime is Texas versus Johnson, when Mr. Johnson burned the flag at the Dallas City Hall in protest of Ronald Reagan's, Republican Party having its convention in Dallas. He burns the flag in protest. For most Americans, that's offensive, right? For many Americans, that's deeply, deeply troubling. But the court is like, yeah, the First Amendment protects those messages that we most despise. And for me, that message is Steve Bannon. He has the right to do it, so I'm going to let him do it, because ultimately I can ignore him, turn off the TV, whatever it is. But I want that First Amendment to protect the messages we most despise.
Okay, so I have to jump in here asking about, like Facebook and conspiracy theories and things
Right.
like that, because there's all this argument, and then Facebook says, well, with the First Amendment and free speech, people can put out any kind of misinformation they want, and we're free to make money on the ads for it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a big Facebook fan, despite the platform with which this podcast is on. But I think there's a difference between saying things like Bannon saying things like we're going to bring down the Biden administration. I heard him say we're going to bring down the Biden regime the other day, yesterday, and dangerous untruths,
Yeah.
right? So I think there should be screening for dangerous untruths. I don't think there should be screening for political speech like Steve Bannon is doing, even though I utterly disagree with it, because then you enter the slippery slope of, what's good and what's not good. But I'm all about social media outlets curbing the absolute lies that happen and shutting people off. Like, I'm all about shutting Donald Trump from social media outlets if he's willing to perpetuate untruths. Period. End of story.
But then there's all the people that believe that Trump actually won the election and that anything else is a lie. So they actually believe that's not a lie.
Right. And they also, and the QAnon people also believe that, all Democrats are pedophiles and Hillary Clinton is eating children on the second floor of a pizza joint. Right. I mean, okay. Are there some conspiracies out there that probably have a kernel of truth? Yes, but that's not one of them, right? So, and no, we shouldn't afford that all conspiracies get free reign. Ultimately, organizations like Facebook and Instagram and so on have a responsibility to kind of point us in the right direction with regard to truths and untruths.
Yeah, it's pretty much
Something in the
with
Constitution
social
about
media.
that? If you
Oh,
were,
with social, oh, sorry, what, Anna?
I was saying, if you were revising the Constitution, would there be something about that, about the truth and, lies and,
Probably not, but I do think if you're revising the Constitution, if you're sitting around Philadelphia's Independence Hall, the group of people is absolutely going to have some set of clauses about social media. No question about it. It's too dominant in our world to ignore it in a constitutional document. What
yeah,
that looks like, Anadea, I don't know,
yeah,
but there would be clauses about social media regulation.
okay.
Yeah.
I got to
Yeah, I
check.
mean, it's gotten to the point where the inmates are running the asylum. Um, so Lisa has a continuation from her asking about Steve Bannon.
Sure.
Saying that Bannon is telling his people to stand by daily, and it's code for a call to arms. He's playing the First Amendment and promoting violence. We've seen this on 1/6.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
I think you have to. This is my own perspective. I can convince myself that to stand by daily has some violent undertones, but it's not really the same type of thing. So I'm willing to let things like that slide. I always think the best strategy is to just ignore him, right? Uh, Ultimately, is he a violent guy? No. Is he inciting? No. But some people will interpret that, and maybe Lisa does, as creating an environment of violence. I don't think you want to enter that slippery slope, because then it becomes way too difficult to bring that sled back up the slippery slope.
Yeah, maybe at a constitutional convention that could be discussed, and whether codified or just tabled, to see what gets allowed, what doesn't get allowed, or everything gets allowed. Like the congressman, that crazy congressman Paul Gosar, in that video he made recently.
Right.
That's horrible.
I think generally speaking, if you're advocating violence, right, you in a direct way, you need to be regulated. You need to be stifled.
Yeah.
I don't see that even if folks think it's a code word, the standby daily is in that same category. You would have to say, in my opinion, something a little bit more extreme for me to
yeah, that's a good point. Marie has another question showing off her French. And
awesome.
I may mangle the language. She wrote, "Thanks so much. In regard to multi-party, as Crozier discussed in La Société Bloquée, the French take to the French, okay, I'm glad you know it. The French take to the streets because of multi-party system going nowhere. So two-party does have advantages. Thanks."
Yeah, so that's so good. Marie knows what she's talking about big time. One of the reasons why people are okay in the United States with the two-party system is it perpetuates stability, right? It does not create the environment in some European countries where people take to the streets. You take the good with the bad, and one of the good is that there is relative political stability despite our polarized environment at the moment, for sure. And I think we're sort of think about Charlottesville, in other words. I think we're inching closer to it, but she's absolutely right. In most European countries, they take to the streets in a way that they don't in the US.
Yeah. So if you have any other questions you'd like to ask, whether through the chat box or Q&A, feel free to do so as we winding down towards the end. I mean, this has been very thought-provoking and fascinating. Whether, as you say, Beau, we may not see a constitutional convention in our lifetimes, there's really no mechanism for it,
right?
Unless somehow Jefferson gets a second wind and
I mean, there are a decent. So one of the things that I found interesting, right, is that a lot of this, Michael, you and I have talked about this a little bit before, when we were in that book event, is the idea of a fundamental constitutional reform has left the academic world and entered the pop culture world, right? Or entered the mainstream media world. So you have, you have the New York Times, right? Jamel Bowie is coming out every other day with some editorial about constitutional reform.
All right. Yeah.
Right. In the last week, he's had 3, I think. You have Chris Rock. Everybody who's on this call, look at Chris Rock. I think it was probably September, October, his Saturday Night Live monologue, where he says, "Why do we need a president?" And he goes on this 5-minute thing about constitutional reform. He doesn't call it constitutional reform, but he's basically questioning the fundamental aspects of the American constitutional order. And so, and then you have The Atlantic, one of the great journals in American society, devote an entire issue to constitutional change. You have the National Constitution Center, our museum for the Constitution, consult with a group of libertarian, a group of progressive, and a group of conservative thinkers to draft new constitutions, called the Constitution Drafting Project. So instead of just these happening in the walls of the academy, there are all sorts of conversations happening about constitutional reform in mainstream media and pop culture that are fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like there are people who understand the issues and trying to come up with new ideas or new ways to do things. But as I say, unless we come to some sort of critical point where we say, okay, we got to do it. Yeah, I had thought, the 2,200 constitution that'd be written, and which comes to 15 constitutions per country. I imagine, and some maybe more, some less, whatever it is. But I imagine for a lot of the countries rewriting their constitution, they came to some sort of rock bottom point or something that made them say, we got to do this over again.
Right. And Anna, back to your question about are we sort of approaching the bottom, the depths of democracy? And we talked about January 6th, right? So January 6th itself would have been a kind of a tragic moment in American history if Pence hadn't had a conscience and stuff like that. What I can tell you would be an even more serious or a relatedly serious moment that would probably perpetuate some sort of constitutional convention would be a president who doesn't leave office on January 20th, or a president who, the most common thing, Michael, that happens around the world is these military coups, right? Remember, the president is commander in chief. So if a president decides that, he's gonna make the military his kind of personal defender, that would be, we'd reach the bottom there. It wouldn't necessarily be kind of the fall of voting. It would be those moments that are kind of abrupt and immediate that would really kind of catapult us to real change.
So one last question from your submitted questions before we wrap up, because this is Voices for the Future. Do you hold out hope for a better political future in the U.S., and if so, why?
I do. I think in my 55 years, and admittedly the first 20, I probably wasn't paying much attention, but for the last 35 years, this is the most depressing moment that I can remember. But I honestly believe that the structure and the citizenry of the United States is ultimately, sure, we are polarized, we are tribal, we are all these things, we are separated in ways, regionally in particular, right? So, I mean, at the risk of offending somebody, my father grew up in Selma, Alabama. I do not understand some of the things some of the stereotypical things that happen in various regions of the country. So not only are we politically polarized, but we're regionally polarized. But I have great faith that, we have been through some tough times in the past. Our Constitution is, remember, I'm a Madisonian. I believe in our Constitution. Our Constitution is good enough. Political figures, for the most part, whether they're on the left or on the right, believe that what's in the best interest of the country. Not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but I have this hope and this faith that American society is on the upward swing. I think a lot will depend on what the 2024 election looks like. I think a lot will depend a little less on the 2022 midterms, but I think, today we're on the upward swing, and I think we're going to emerge a little bit better in the next decade than we are right now.
Let's hope you're right.
Yeah, thank you. It's a
You're right.
good way to end on a hopeful note.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, everybody.
Thank you, Beau. It's been
You're
great.
so intelligent on all this and so well thought of it and thought through all these. I could listen to you for a long time, and I'm sure our listeners could too. Where can they get your book or follow you?
I don't have any social media presence, but if they are interested in the book, Stanford University Press. My last name is Breslin, and you can get it on Amazon. It's called The Constitution for the Living, and I mean, Michael, I think you would attest to this. It's, I hope, a fun read because it's storytelling about imaginary constitutional conventions over the course of American history.
Oh yeah, it held I think, not just my interest, I would say anyone who reads it would hold their interest. And, it's a part historical drama, and
Right.
then a part, especially the last chapter, what could be,
Yeah.
especially like that idea that you put forth about a third institution in the legislative body or of Congress, because I thought that what a great solution for this. So it helps us dream of what could be.
Okay.
Maybe we need another musical like Hamilton to be about constitutional regeneration.
I should send my thing to Lin-Manuel, right? My book to
There you
Lin-Manuel.
Yeah,
go. Have him write another one. Yeah.
yeah,
For
yeah,
sure. I don't know if he would take it seriously, but maybe I'll do that.
yeah.
I want to thank all the listeners too. And we are coming to the end of the year of these webinars that Michael and I have been doing. And for our December one, we decided that we won't have a guest, but we will have a discussion. And come and bring your questions and your comments, and we'll, people who have been with us all year listening to these different things, let's debate some of it. And that will be on what date, Michael?
December 7th, Tuesday, December 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So we'll have everybody on screen with us to hold the discussion together. And we'll probably do breakout
list. You'll get an announcement about it, but do
Yeah.
show up, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion.
For sure. Great.
Thank
Well,
you so much, Beau.
All right.
yeah,
Thanks, guys. I'm out.
Okay. Yeah. See you soon.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.